Hello there, I'm Moldy, and right now, completely unintentionally, the most two popular videos on this channel are my Captain Rex Y-Wing modification using 5 of the microfighters, and then of course my minifigure scale video from last year. But that minifigure scale video only really touched on 145 scale and 130 scale. Today, we're going to be covering every single one. Maybe not every single scale, considering you can just pluck a number out of the air and go with that number as your scale. But at least all of the common ones and seeing what LEGO Star Wars sets fall into which categories. But before I tackle any of these scales, I'd just like to lay some ground rules. These minifigure scales can be used for any theme that uses LEGO minifigures. I haven't quite got around to working with mini dolls, and they are slightly taller than minifigures, so the scales will inherently be just that little bit bigger. But not all of these scales we'll go over in this video actually use this style of minifigure for their scale. We're using nano figures, micro figures, and even getting towards studs towards the end, because minifigure scale typically relates to these guys here, the LEGO minifigure. But these minifigures can also be represented in different ways. Don't worry, this is not going to be a video of me trying to get out of building a 145 Star Destroyer when we hit 100k subs. That's right, I do not know how to back down, so we're going full steam ahead for that project, and I'll probably need to start that pretty soon. Today we'll also be taking a look at the brick-built Captain Rex Y-Wing. This thing is minifigure scale to a 145 minifigure scale to be precise. And I do have videos up on the channel which I will leave linked in the description to help you build your models in 145 scale. And I think I also mentioned 130 scale using a bunch of different equations which you can program straight into Excel or Google Sheets, which is absolutely free, and it makes your job a lot easier. But first off, the reason I rebuilt or built Captain Rex's Y-Wing, I never built this ship originally, and I don't exactly know why, because today I didn't go out and buy 5 Captain Rex Y-Wings. I can't find a Captain Rex Y-Wing in any of the stores near me, because I guess they sold well enough that stores don't need to stock them anymore. All of these pieces are fairly common to build anyway, and the instructions are up completely free on Rebrickable, so go check them out, and members will also have access to it over in the members Discord, where they get every set of instructions for absolutely free. At the higher tier, brick tier, though, I do give some instructions to the lower tier sometimes too. If you've opened and built the smaller microfighter Y-Wing, you'll notice straight away it was nowhere near this big, and the engines are looking a little bit thin, but besides that, this ship is really bulky all over. We've even got the stud shooter missiles on the back here acting as the turret, and it does sit 2 people in the cockpit, just like we see Rex and Ahsoka hop in towards the end of the Clone Wars. What I've done with the pieces from 5 sets, not all of the pieces, but definitely most of the pieces from this microfighter, is expanded it to match the length of 1/45 of an in-universe Empire Strikes Back Y-Wing. Perfect for the anniversary of Empire Strikes Back this year. Now, on top of that, you can't just stretch out the model, so I've increased the width, and again, we do go over that in a previous video. But why have I chosen the numbers that I have for this model? Well, 145 scale is the scale that I do here on the channel for the most part, and though we're likely to jump around from time to time dependent how many parts we have to work with in specific sets, it all started with this here Anakin's Pod Racer, which is the original set. In fact, it's one of the only sets I didn't modify, because when I was looking into the ATTE and the gunship, I've modified the doors on the gunship, the interior of the ATTE. I think the only other set that I haven't touched whatsoever is the X-Wing that came with Jan Dodana, Leia, R2, and Luke Skywalker. And that's purely because I haven't got to modifying it yet, so that's going to be the next one on my list. But when I was building Anakin's Pod Racer, straight away it looked like something straight from the screens of Phantom Menace. Even though LEGO do a really good job building models, it's very rare that something looks straight from the screen. Another example is the ATTE. I think the proportions of that are really cool. But something like the gunship, for instance, the wings are definitely a couple studs too thin, and they perhaps don't have the exact same angle that we used to seeing for the LAATs. So when I got this set, which is like 5-6 years old now, I measured up the different scales, the length of it, the width, and I probably also tested out the height, though I'm not sure we've got any height measurements for Anakin's pod racer. Plugged them into a graph to find out it was pretty much bang on 145 scale, which is amazing if you want to build Cobb speed up, because it's just one of Anakin's engines. 145 means 1/45. It means this ship is 1/45th of the life-size ship, and the props don't usually measure up to how big they are on screens when we see them in Star Wars, because even when it comes to props, if they can cut corners, if they cannot make parts of the ship, for instance, the back of the Y-Wing probably rarely gets built, and there's just a load of cockpits around this Lucasfilm studio when they get to filming. So when it comes to Star Wars specifically, sometimes measurements don't add up as much as we would like. But this isn't just Star Wars ships that this can be done with. I got a comment recently asking about medieval sets, and you can definitely build a castle using this 145 scale. But like I said, it's not the only scale. Now, I've jotted down a few different scales I've seen popular on Rebrickable, right here on YouTube and on other sites like Instagram that people build their minifigures to. And there are quite a few bigger scales for minifigures, as in we're scaling the minifigure up rather than the ship. For smaller creatures like mounts and for different bits of scenery, but I found those to be very, very inconsistent. So the closest we're going to get to life size is 1/30 scale. And I know the Lego Star Wars community specifically is split between 130 and 145. So you probably already know a lot about those two. 130 is usually used for Starfighter playsets. We're looking at the recent Ahsoka Eta Starfighter, and even any of the old ones, Anakin's, Kenobi's, are usually around that 130 minifigure scale, and the same goes with the Deltas. This is so much easier for Lego to do because 130 correlates to the width of a minifigure. If you work on the height of the minifigure, usually the minifigures wide are minifigures without arms, so it'll make them very, very hard, even though it's possible, because I've turned both Etas and Deltas into 145 scale and still managed to fit the minifigures in, even though Anakin's cockpit is absolutely massive compared to the size it should be. And you can find both instructions for these and most of the ships that I show you over on my Rebrickable. It's just easier to work with a wider ship, so they usually tone it to 130 scale, 1/30th of life size, which is going off an average human being 180 centimeters tall. So that's where the 130, 145 measurements are actually derived from, at least from my experience. Of course, if you're working with different heights and trying to scale them up based on the pilot in the ship, for instance, you might find that you're a stud over or under compared to my own. But thankfully with Lego, that's another really fun thing. Because we're working in studs which lock to 8mm of space, it's like working on an 8mm grid. You can do half plates. It's just easier if you round up to the nearest stud or round down, dependent how close you are. What you'll find is most of our measurements should be pretty much the same, because no matter what sort of heights we are using, by rounding up or rounding down, we're all going to come to the same conclusion. Going up from 130 is 145, which I have spoke of, and as we go up in scale, as the number gets bigger from 30 to 45, the ships get quite a bit smaller. One of the main reasons I shrink from 130 scale to 145 is standing right behind me, or more so hanging on the wall right behind me. This is my parts bin on the wall, on show for the world to see. And when you're shrinking down ships from 130 scale to 145, you tend to have quite a few parts left over, which is really, really handy for building more models. But not only that, you've seen my Home 1 hanger display with 2 A-Wings on. If they were 130 scale, I could have definitely fit 1 A-Wing on there, but I don't think I'd be squeezing a second one behind it. 145 is definitely a more popular mock scale if I had to choose one out of the two, and it correlates to minifigure heights again being that 180 centimeters. But that's not to say 130 is any worse, because both of these are used for very different purposes. 130 is bigger, so it gets more detail, but 145 allows it to be consistent with scalings of bigger ships. Some LEGO sets that are roughly 145 scale, and I have spoken about this again in a previous video. We've got the ATTE, we've got the gunship, which is close enough to 145 scale, the old 2012 TIE Fighter. I do have to say, I don't think the AT-80 playset is too far off 145, maybe about 150, 155 scale, but that's close to 145 scale. And by shrinking ships, another ship that I've shrunk to 145 scale is the Fang Fighter, which, if you get the Fang Fighter versus TIE Interceptor, I think the TIE Fighter is pretty close to 145, but the Fang Fighter is 130, which makes them both look roughly the same size, which they're definitely not in universe. But by making ships 145 scale, it allows you to compare them side by side and see much more accurately the difference in sizes and some of the features between the ships. This is a 145 Y-Wing from the original trilogy, though it is using Captain Rex's. I think the original trilogy Y-Wing was a little bit smaller than the prequel trilogy one. And next to it, we've got a Fang Fighter, which is not the Comrade class, not the massive one. This is the little dinky fighter that goes out in front and takes down a few of those TIE Interceptors. So you can see just how big the size difference is. I mean, it's about 3 Fang Fighters long, this Y-Wing. But like I said, these aren't the only 2 scales we're going to get through today. So there's so much more content on the channel about those minifigure scales specifically. I'll leave all the links in the description. But now let's go even bigger, because LEGO have released so many sets, and recently we've seen the revival of the helmet line. They are definitely a lot bigger than 130 scale. If I had to take a stab in the dark, I'd probably say they're about 1/4 scale, but I'm sure someone else has worked that out. If we go on the other end of the spectrum, we've got ships like the midi scale sets, and even some of the bigger play sets like this Ghost Starfighter and Phantom 2, which definitely isn't anywhere near 130 or 140 scale, because this should probably be about the size of the entire Ghost. I'm afraid General Grievous isn't in there. If you know, you know. But this Ghost right here and the Falcon playsets, and I'm sure there's a ton of others like Kylo Ren's shuttle, are usually scaled roughly to 185 scale. So not quite twice as small as 145, but we are taking another step down, and this is really nice because it allows these really big ships, which if we are going to try and size them up to 145 scale, just like this, you're going to want to double them in every single dimension, which is where the UCS Millennium Falcon does add up quite nicely, similar to the AT-80, which are roughly at those minifigure scales. And if we ever get a UCS Ghost, I think that would be really, really cool. And having not picked up the Millennium Falcon, the Ghost would be so tempting. Something really nice with the numbers, you'll notice that at 185 scale, I was able to say that the 145 scale ships would be about half their size compared to this model. Or to make it easier, this should be doubled compared to them. And that is to do exclusively with the numbers 45 and 85, or we can round it up to 90 to make it a little bit easier, because at 190 scale, you're saying this is 1/90th of the length of the Ghost. And at 145 scale, it's 1/45th, or 2/90ths of the length. So you can see where this is going. If we wanted to make this comparable to the Delta, for instance, at 2/90ths, we're going to have to times this by 2 to get to 2/90ths, or 1/45th scale. So even though this isn't 145 scale, we can still see that, well, this is going to be double the length, double the width, double the height, and even the Phantom 2 on the back will be double in every dimension compared to any of our 145 scale ships. So do we actually need to keep them all in 145 to be able to compare them? And I do have to give a shout out to Bothman Bricks here on the platform, because he does have a minifigure scale which gradually shrinks as it gets bigger. Well, the number at the scale grows, but the ships get smaller. And I do think that's a really great idea when you are working with some bigger ships like Star Destroyers, for instance. But we're still not done yet, because I've mentioned the MIDI scale ships, which are a lot smaller than this Ghost, and there are 2 more scales that we'll be getting into after 185. 185 scales up to microfighters, which I actually have quite a few here from the old Lego board games. So this is the height of a minifigure, very close to the little nano ships you can see in your local toy stores, which are also another really cool collectible. But there's still a smaller minifigure. You may have noticed in the Emperor's throne room, we got a little golden statue, and it's been present a bit throughout Lego Star Wars, but mostly in some of the giant Harry Potter sets. And these are nano figures, smaller than micro nano figures, and these scale up to 1/144, which is going almost twice as small, yet again not quite, but I think close enough to round up for the sake of this demonstration. So we've jumped from the width of a minifigure, which probably does add up to some of the older Lego minifigures here, which are still 4 bricks wide, just a bit taller. So I guess this is a 1/30 scale minifigure. I'm definitely going to have to measure that. Next up, we have 1/45 scale, which is the typical minifigure. We've then got the micro figures, which were popular decades ago with the Lego board games, which I'd really like Lego to bring back. Harry Potter have some of these micro minifigures, as well the nano figures. Not micro, micro's the last one. Make your guess. You can't even see half of these minifigures just on the back here. What do you think's even smaller than the nano minifigure? And I'll give you a hint, it's not 1 stud. It's actually 2 studs. So I guess it's 1 stud and then another. But if the nano minifigure was 144, then the 2 stud is 1/220 scale. And we're not even at our smallest scale yet. I wouldn't say it's as close as double. This is more like 2/3 to double of the previous scale. But you've probably seen in the Millennium Falcon MIDI scale ship, we've got a little scene with a bunch of stud built characters. And I think Chewbacca even uses a 3rd stud, which is really, really funny. We've also got studs in the Imperial Super Star Destroyer, so that's probably not far off this scale. The MIDI scale ships are all meant to be the same length rather than scale to each other, because on one hand, you've got the Falcon, one hand, you've got the Super Star Destroyer, and neither of them are anywhere near the same size. In case you forgot, in Empire Strikes Back, the Falcon actually hides out on the Super Star Destroyer. So perhaps the Falcon's closer to 1/44 scale. And last but not least, which is really the biggest scale you can go in minifigure scale before you just have to disregard the minifigure and use studs as LAAT gunships, we've got the single stud, which there's no going smaller than that. The stud is the smallest. We've got little pins, and we could probably try and come up with a scale for that, but even the pins have their basis. Any bar elements are longer than half a stud, so the smallest we can get is a 1x1 Lego stud. I guess if we're going off density, we can even have the one with the hole in the middle, but this is used for 1/500 scale, which if we were to apply these to a Star Destroyer, just a regular bog standard length Star Destroyer, I think they're about 1.6 kilometers in length. So a regular Star Destroyer in this 1/500 scale is 3.2 meters, which probably isn't too far off the UCS ship, though I don't think the UCS ship was too much over 2 meters. So as we step up, and this is probably what I'll be doing when building the minifigure scale Super Star Destroyer, because I think a 1/30 Super Star Destroyer reaching like 15 meters would look really, really cool. But I'm going to need a lot of help for that. So I'll probably start off with a 3-meter one, which probably could get away with being on the top of that unit. And then we'll build up and double it in scale and double it again, double it, all the way up to 100k subscribers. But hopefully this video has helped you out a little bit with minifigure scales. It's a very, very complex topic, and if this is stressing you out at all, you don't have to be pinpoint accurate with your numbers, as long as it looks like it will work in the scale, as long as the bigger ship is bigger than the smaller ship. I think you're going to be all right with building. But this does apply to areas outside of Star Wars, especially with the Speed Champion cars. Speed Champions, for instance, are about 130 scale compared to the city cars, which are closer to that 145, so they can have other bricks put to better use in the actual buildings, which kind of makes sense for the city sets compared to Speed Champions. But let me know what you think of my Captain Rex Y-Wing. It's a very sturdy model. I was for sure expecting these engines to be bouncing off all video, and I'm very impressed having only just built this in person what feels like a year after the set has come out. How sturdy this actually is, so give it another look. I will leave the video on the end screen for you to check out, but that's all we've got time for today. Hopefully you've learned something new, and may the bricks be with you always.